What if I told you that right now, growing wild in American fields and forests, there are crops that fed entire civilizations, survived droughts that killed everything else, and produced more food with less work than anything in your garden today? I'm talking about plants that Native Americans cultivated for thousands of years, that pioneers depended on, that your great-great-grandparents grew without thinking twice. Plants that laughed at pests, thrived in terrible soil, and came back year after year without replanting. And we just forgot about them, completely erased them from our agricultural memory in just 3 or 4 generations. Today, I'm showing you 25 lost crops of America that will make you question everything you thought you knew about farming and gardening. And before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to share with you is information that could literally change how you grow food forever. And most people will never hear about these plants because they're not sold in stores, they're not taught in agriculture classes, and big seed companies pretend they don't exist. Stick with me because number 14 was so important to Native Americans that tribes would go to war over the best places to harvest it, and it's probably growing within 10 miles of your house right now. And number 22 was the primary protein source for entire communities, produces more food per plant than soybeans, and is so indestructible that you can't kill it even if you try. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, welcome to a community of growers who are tired of being told what to plant by corporations who care more about shipping and shelf life than actual nutrition and taste. We're here to rediscover the plants that actually work, the ones that survived because they were good at being plants, not because some laboratory decided they looked pretty in a grocery store. And to those of you who come back every week, thank you. Your stories about trying unusual crops and your questions keep me inspired to dig deeper into this forgotten knowledge. Let me tell you something that's going to sound crazy. American agriculture before European contact was in some ways more sophisticated than what we do today. Indigenous peoples across this continent had been selecting, breeding, and cultivating crops for over 10,000 years. They developed varieties perfectly adapted to local conditions. They understood companion planting, soil health, and sustainable yields in ways we're only starting to relearn. And then, in just a couple hundred years, we abandoned almost all of it. Why? Because European colonizers showed up and decided that only European crops counted as real agriculture. Never mind that corn, beans, and squash produced more food per acre than wheat. Never mind that indigenous root crops stored longer than potatoes. Never mind that native perennials came back every year while European annuals had to be replanted every spring. There was a systematic effort to replace indigenous agriculture with European-style farming. And in the process, we lost hundreds of crops brilliantly suited to growing in North America. Then came industrial agriculture, which made things even worse. In the 1900s, we decided farms needed to be factories. Everything had to be standardized, mechanized, and profitable at massive scale. Plant breeders started selecting for only a few traits. How well does it ship? How long does it last on a shelf? How uniform does it look? And can you harvest it with a machine? Flavor, nutrition, ease of growing, and adaptation to local conditions? Those got thrown out the window. And that's how we ended up where we are today, growing a handful of crops that require enormous inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water, while literally hundreds of Native American crops that grew perfectly well with none of that stuff just sit there forgotten. But here's the exciting part. They're not extinct. Most of them are still out there. Some are growing wild. Some are maintained by seed savers and indigenous communities. And when you grow them, you tap into thousands of years of selection for plants that genuinely want to grow in American soil and climate. So let's dive in. Here are 25 lost crops of America, ranking them from impressive to absolutely mind-blowing. Number 1, Jerusalem artichoke, which isn't from Jerusalem and isn't an artichoke, but is a native North American sunflower that produces knobby tubers tasting like a cross between artichoke heart and water chestnut. Native peoples across the eastern half of North America cultivated this plant long before European contact. The tubers are sweet, crunchy, and incredibly nutritious, loaded with prebiotic fiber that's amazing for gut health. The plant grows 6 to 10 feet tall, produces beautiful yellow sunflowers in fall, and the tubers multiply underground. You plant a few pounds, and within 2 years, you'll have more than you can possibly use. They're perennial. Plant once and harvest forever. They'll grow in terrible soil, handle drought better than almost any vegetable, have zero pest problems, and they're so vigorous that the challenge isn't getting them to grow, it's keeping them contained. They'll store for months in the ground or in your refrigerator. You can eat them raw, roasted, sautéed, pickled, or dried into flour. Native Americans knew this plant was a gift. They traded varieties across thousands of miles, and European settlers relied on them heavily, especially during hard winters. Then somewhere along the way, we decided potatoes were easier and just stopped planting them. Number 2, groundnut, not to be confused with peanuts, but an actual Native American legume vine producing chains of small potato-like tubers. This plant is legitimately incredible. The tubers are 17% protein, 3 times higher than potatoes. They taste like a cross between potatoes and beans with a slightly nutty flavor. They're dense, filling, and nutritious. Groundnut was a staple food for Native Americans throughout the eastern forests. The Pilgrims literally survived their first winters by eating ground nut that indigenous people showed them. It's mentioned in historical records over and over as a famine food that saved lives. The vines grow wild along streams and in wet areas, climbing up trees and shrubs. They're nitrogen-fixing, which means they improve soil while they grow. The tubers form on roots like beads on a string. Each year, the chains get longer and produce more tubers. You harvest in fall, leave some tubers in the ground, and they come back bigger the next year. The plants also produce fragrant flowers that smell like cinnamon and rose and attract bees like crazy. This is a perennial protein source that requires almost no care and comes back stronger every year. Why isn't every homestead growing this? Because commercial agriculture can't mechanize the harvest. But for gardeners, it's perfect. Number 3, arrowhead, also called duck potato or wapato. This is an aquatic plant that Native Americans cultivated in shallow ponds, streams, and wetlands all across North America. The plant produces marble-sized tubers tasting like sweet potatoes, but with a lighter texture. Indigenous peoples would harvest them by wading into shallow water and loosening them with their toes. The tubers would float to the surface, and they'd gather them in baskets. Entire economies were based on arrowhead. In the Pacific Northwest, wapato was such an important crop that prime growing areas were owned and managed by families and passed down through generations. Lewis and Clark wrote about buying large quantities of it from Native Americans. The plant is perennial and incredibly productive. One good patch can produce 50 pounds of tubers in a season. It's also beautiful, with arrow-shaped leaves and white flowers. If you have a pond, a stream, or even just a kiddie pool in your yard, you can grow this. The tubers form in fall, store in the ground all winter, and you harvest them in early spring when they're at their sweetest. They're high in carbohydrates and surprisingly filling. You can roast them, boil them, or dry them into flour. This was a major crop for thousands of years, and now almost nobody even knows it exists. Number 4, prairie turnip, also called prairie potato or timpsula. This is a wild plant that grows across the Great Plains, and it was one of the most important foods for plains tribes. The plant is a legume with a deep taproot that swells into a tuber. The tubers are starchy, slightly sweet, and taste like a cross between a turnip and a potato with a hint of coconut. They're incredibly nutritious and were considered sacred by many tribes. Prairie turnip grows wild in shortgrass prairie, which tells you everything about how tough it is. It handles blazing heat, drought, cold winters, and poor soil. The plant is small and unassuming above ground, but the root can go down several feet. Native peoples would harvest them in early summer when the plant was flowering so they could find them easily. They'd carefully dig the roots, replant the crown, and cover it back up so the plant would regenerate. They'd braid the roots and dry them, and dried prairie turnip would store for years. When you needed food, you'd rehydrate them and cook them. They were so valuable that they were used as trade goods and wealth. Tribes would travel long distances to areas with good prairie turnip harvests. Today, there are efforts to bring this plant back into cultivation. It's not easy to grow from seed, but once established, it's permanent and nearly indestructible. Number 5, Hopness, another name for ground nut worth mentioning because different regions had different varieties. Eastern and Great Lakes tribes cultivated varieties producing larger tubers and earlier harvests. Some had tubers the size of eggs. There were cultural practices around growing them, planting along travel routes for food supplies, near fishing spots for complete meals, cultivating them in wetland areas, and protecting those areas as food resources. This sophisticated crop management is agriculture, full stop. Number 6, chia. And yes, the same chia from Chia Pets. But chia is actually a native plant from the Southwest in Mexico, and it was a major food crop for centuries. The seeds are packed with omega-3 fatty acids, protein, and fiber. They absorb water and form a gel, making them incredibly filling. Indigenous peoples of the Southwest would carry chia on long journeys. Warriors would eat it before battle. The plant grows about 3 feet tall with purple or white flower spikes. It handles heat and drought beautifully. One plant produces thousands of seeds. You can eat them raw, toast them, grind them into flour, or mix them with water. The Aztecs valued chia so highly that it was given as tribute and used as currency. Then the Spanish conquest tried to erase indigenous crops. Chia nearly went extinct. It's only been rediscovered in the last 20 years as a health food. But it's easy to grow, incredibly productive, and perfectly adapted to hot, dry climates. Number 7, quinoa, which most people think comes from South America. And the plant did originate there, but northern varieties that Native Americans in the Southwest and Colorado were growing were adapted to shorter growing seasons and higher elevations. The plants look like colorful amaranth with seed heads in shades of red, orange, pink, and gold. Quinoa is high in complete protein, which is rare for a plant. It handles poor soil, high altitude, and temperature swings. Indigenous peoples had been growing quinoa for thousands of years, developing hundreds of varieties. When Spanish colonizers arrived, they suppressed quinoa cultivation because they wanted indigenous people dependent on European wheat. Now it's trendy and expensive in health food stores, but you can grow it yourself easily. If you're realizing there's a whole world of crops you never knew existed, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this video to others who need to see it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're bringing back forgotten food plants, and I don't want you to miss a single video. Number 8, amaranth, specifically the Native American varieties. Amaranth was a major crop for Aztecs, Mayans, and Pueblo peoples. The seeds are tiny but packed with protein, and the leaves are edible greens tasting like spinach. The plants are stunningly beautiful, growing 6 to 8 feet tall with massive seed heads in red, purple, gold, or green. One plant can produce a pound of seeds. Amaranth handles heat, drought, and poor soil without complaint. It actually grows better in hot weather when other crops are struggling. You can pop the seeds like popcorn, cook them like rice, grind them into flour, or sprout them. The Spanish banned amaranth cultivation because it was used in indigenous religious practices. The crop nearly went extinct, but survived in remote areas. If you have hot summers and want low-maintenance, high-nutrition crops, amaranth is your answer. Number 9. Sunflower, which everyone knows, but most don't realize sunflowers were domesticated by Native Americans at least 4,500 years ago. Indigenous peoples cultivated sunflowers, selecting for larger seeds, higher oil content, and different colors. Some varieties had seeds the size of pumpkin seeds. The seeds were eaten raw, roasted, ground into butter, or pressed for oil. Sunflowers are native to North America and brilliantly adapted to our climate. They handle heat, cold, drought, and poor soil. Modern hybrid sunflowers are bred for commercial oil production and have tiny, hard-to-shell seeds. But heirloom varieties bred by Native Americans have huge, meaty seeds that are easy to harvest. Number 10. Wild rice, which isn't actually rice but a native aquatic grass producing edible grains. For tribes like the Ojibwe, wild rice was the most important food source. Entire seasonal rounds were organized around rice harvests. The grains have a nutty, earthy flavor and are higher in protein than regular rice. Wild rice is perennial and comes back every year. It reseeds itself naturally. Traditional harvesting involves canoeing through rice beds and knocking ripe grains into the canoe. This is sophisticated, sustainable agriculture. If you have a pond or wetland, you can establish wild rice. It provides food and habitat for wildlife. Number 11. Tepary beans, native to the desert southwest and cultivated by Tohono O'odham, Pima, and Pueblo peoples. Tepary beans are incredibly drought-tolerant and heat-loving. They can grow with as little as 10 inches of rain per year, less than half what regular beans need. They have a rich, nutty flavor and cook faster than pinto beans. They're higher in protein and fiber. They handle 100+ degree heat without blinking. And they fix nitrogen, improving soil. These beans were a staple for desert peoples because they were reliable when other crops failed. If you garden in hot, dry climates, tepary beans are a gift. Number 12. Devil's Claw, a native plant from the southwest producing edible seed pods. The young pods taste like okra. The mature pods have long, curved claws used by Native Americans for basket weaving. The seeds inside taste like sunflower seeds. Devil's Claw grows as a sprawling annual vine in hot, dry conditions. This is a dual-purpose crop, food and fiber, and it grows where almost nothing else will. Number 13. Prickly pear cactus, specifically varieties cultivated for fruit and pads. The pads, called nopales, are eaten as a vegetable and taste like tart green beans. The fruits, called tunas, are sweet and can be eaten fresh or made into jam. Prickly pear is about as low maintenance as a crop can get. It needs almost no water, grows in terrible soil, handles extreme heat and cold, and produces food year after year. In Mexico and the Southwest, nopales are still a common food. But in most of the U.S., we treat prickly pear as ornamental or nuisance. This is a perennial vegetable that produces in climates where almost nothing else will grow. Number 14, the one I mentioned earlier, wild greens like lamb's quarters, amaranth, and purslane. Many Native American groups manage them, leaving patches in fields and harvesting them as supplemental greens. Lamb's quarters was called the gift plant because it showed up wherever soil was disturbed and produced nutritious greens. The leaves are higher in calcium, iron, and protein than spinach. Purslane is succulent and lemony, packed with omega-3s. These plants grow as weeds in gardens all over America. People spray and pull them. Meanwhile, they're more nutritious than the vegetables we're trying to grow. Native Americans understood that you don't fight productive plants. You use them. This is sophisticated ecological thinking we've lost. Number 15. Wild plum, native across North America in various species. Native Americans cultivated plum trees near villages, selected for fruit quality, and managed groves through pruning and controlled burns. The fruits are small but intensely flavored, and they make incredible jam, leather, and dried fruit. Wild plums are tough trees that handle cold, heat, drought, and poor soil. They produce fruit reliably without spraying or fussing. The trees sucker and form thickets, meaning one tree becomes many over time. This is perennial food production that requires almost no maintenance. Number 16. Wild grapes, which grow across the entire continent in dozens of species. Native Americans cultivated grapes near villages, selected vines with better fruit, and trained them up trees and arbors. The grapes are smaller than European types, but more intense in flavor. They're perfect for juice, jelly, and wine. Wild grapevines are so vigorous that they can take over entire trees. They produce fruit with zero care. This is a perennial crop that produces for decades. Number 17. Hazelnut, specifically the American hazelnut growing wild across the eastern U.S. Native Americans managed hazelnut thickets through selective pruning and burning. The nuts are small but rich and flavorful. American hazelnuts are shrubs that handle any soil, any climate zone, and produce nuts reliably. They're also nitrogen-fixing, which improves soil. European hazelnuts are larger but finicky about climate and susceptible to blight. American hazelnuts are immune and unstoppable. Plant them once and harvest forever. Number 18. Pawpaw, a native fruit tree producing the largest edible fruit native to North America. Pawpaws taste like a cross between banana, mango, and custard. They're rich, creamy, and tropical tasting, despite growing in temperate forests. The trees grow wild in the understory of eastern forests. They handle shade, which is rare for a fruiting tree. They have no serious pests. The fruits ripen in fall and are incredibly perishable, which is why you'll never see them in stores. But for backyard growers, they're perfect. Once mature, they produce 50 to 100 pounds of fruit per tree. This is a gourmet fruit that requires less care than apples. Number 19. Persimmon, the American persimmon growing wild across the South and Midwest. Native Americans harvested persimmons, dried them into cakes, and stored them for winter. The fruits are small but incredibly sweet when fully ripe. American persimmon trees are drought-tolerant, pest-resistant, and produce fruit without any care. A mature tree can produce hundreds of pounds of fruit. The challenge is waiting for them to be fully ripe. Unripe persimmons are astringent and mouth-puckering, but once ripe, usually after frost, they're like candy. Number 20. Chinquapin, a relative of chestnuts native to the eastern U.S. Native Americans harvested chinquapins and managed groves. The nuts are small but sweet and were eaten raw, roasted, or ground into flour. Chinquapin trees and shrubs are more blight-resistant than American chestnuts. They produce nuts reliably and handle poor soil. This is another perennial nut crop that requires almost no care. Number 21. Blackberries and raspberries, which grow wild across the continent. Native Americans manage them through burning and pruning to encourage fruit production. The berries are high in vitamins and were eaten fresh, dried, or made into preserves. Wild brambles are so productive and aggressive that they need no help from humans. They spread by root suckers and produce fruit on second-year canes. If you have space for a bramble patch, you have a perennial fruit source that will never quit. Number 22, the one I teased earlier, mesquite. Mesquite trees are native to the Southwest and were one of the most important food sources for desert peoples. The seed pods are ground into flour that's sweet, nutty, and high in protein. Mesquite flour was a staple food, sometimes making up 70% of the diet. The trees are perennial, nitrogen-fixing, and produce pods even in extreme drought. They need no irrigation once established, and a mature tree can produce 200 pounds of pods per year. That's more protein per acre than soybeans in ideal conditions, and mesquite does it in the desert. This is one of the most productive, sustainable crops on Earth, and we treat it as a weed. Number 23. Yucca, which produces edible flowers, fruits, and roots. Native Americans across the Southwest and Great Plains cultivated yucca. The flower stalks are roasted and taste like asparagus. The fruits are eaten raw or cooked. The roots can be processed into flour. Yucca is drought-tolerant, perennial, and nearly indestructible. It grows in pure sand, handles temperature extremes, and produces food with zero inputs. Number 24. Acorns, which technically aren't a crop, but were managed extensively by Native Americans. California tribes, in particular, cultivated oak groves through burning, pruning, and selective harvesting. Acorns were the staple food, providing more calories than any other source. They're ground into flour after leaching out the tannins. Acorn flour is nutty, rich, and nutritious. Oak trees are perennial, produce for centuries, and require no care. A mature oak can produce several hundred pounds of acorns per year. This is a permanent food source. And number 25. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash grown together. This isn't a single crop, but it's such an important agricultural system that it deserves the final spot. Native Americans across the continent developed three sisters planting. Corn provides a stalk for beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen to feed the corn and squash. Squash shades the soil, conserves moisture, and suppresses weeds. Together, they produce more food per acre than any single crop and improve soil rather than depleting it. This is brilliant, sustainable polyculture that modern agriculture is only starting to understand. The three sisters fed civilizations and represent the pinnacle of indigenous agricultural knowledge. So there you have it, 25 crops that fed people across this continent for thousands of years. Crops adapted to American soil and climate. Crops that produce reliably with minimal inputs. Crops selected over generations for actual usefulness rather than appearance and shipping. And we forgot almost all of them in just a few generations. But here's the hopeful part. They're not gone. Seeds are still available. Knowledge is being preserved by indigenous communities and seed savers. And when you plant these crops, you're not just growing food. You're participating in a tradition that goes back thousands of years. You're preserving genetic diversity and cultural knowledge. You're proving that there's a better way to grow food than the industrial model. My challenge to you is simple. Pick 3 crops from this list. Find seeds from native seed companies and heirloom seed sellers. Plant them next season. Give them the same chance you'd give any other crop, and see what happens. I guarantee you'll learn something. You'll probably get more food with less work, and you'll be part of bringing back agricultural wisdom that we desperately need. If this video opened your eyes to crops you never knew existed, smash that like button. Leave a comment telling me which crop you're most excited to try. Are you Team Perennial Roots, Team Desert Crops, Team Indigenous Grains? I want to hear from you, and if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're bringing back lost agricultural knowledge one crop at a time, and I want you on this journey with me. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and remember that some of the best crops are the ones everyone forgot about. They're waiting for you to bring them back. Now get out there and start planting. I'll see you in the next video.